The premise of this series is this: if God, or anybody else for that matter, were to come to you and say, so you claim to be a Christian, you say you're a Christian, could I see some identification, please? What identification would you show them? And we've been talking about the fact that really the identification marks of being a Christian, being truly born again by the Spirit of God, are what Paul calls in Galatians chapter 5, the fruit of the Spirit. And we have worked through each one individually. They start in verse 22, if you have a copy of God's Word there in front of you. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness. Now look up here before we get to today's. Has God just been beating anybody else up over these except me? Am I the only one? Well, I have just really discovered I have some real weaknesses in some of these areas, but I'm a little stronger in a couple than I thought maybe I was, and so I hope that's been your experience if you've been with us throughout this series as well. Today's the last one, and it is the subject of self-control. Ugh. Self-control. Are you kidding me? We have to talk about self-control? We have to talk about self-control. Why do you suppose God saved probably the hardest of these for the last? I don't know, but this one's tough. And so are you ready for a tough message today? Okay, 3. Well, I think we can learn some things that will help us this morning. Let's talk about self-control. Easy definition of this. Self-control simply means self-mastery. That's all it means, self-mastery. Now, somebody once said that we seem to be able to control everything but ourselves. I think that's true sometimes. One of my favorite stories about self-control is the day that a single dad was going through Walmart, and he had his very young child there in the basket with him as they were shopping, and the child was just throwing an ever-loving fit. Your kids ever do that? Always at the worst time, isn't it? And that's the way it was this day. Just screaming at the top of his lungs all the way through Walmart, and going down the aisle, that dad could be heard saying, now calm down, Albert. Don't scream, Albert. Just stay calm, Albert. And a lady who heard all of this going on and was watching him was kind of impressed. And so she said, sir, I want to commend you on your patience with your son Albert. He said, lady, he's not Albert, I'm Albert. Self-control. I guess if you have kids, you probably know what that's like, huh? Isn't it true that we would operate in every fruit of the Spirit all the time, all 9 of them, if we truly practiced self-control? Isn't it true that we would not have any problems ever with any of the sins that were listed? One of the first messages in this series, we looked at the list earlier in chapter 5, things that I categorized as Paul's description as of the unsaved life. Isn't it true we wouldn't have any problem with that list of sins if we truly practiced self-control? In his book, Becoming a Healthy Church, Stephen Macchia says that in essence, Paul is saying here that for us to truly live out a Spirit-empowered life, we need a healthy self-mastery which is ready at a moment's notice to serve the needs of others. When we are self-absorbed, wanting to meet our needs first, and seeking out the most pleasurable way to do so, then we are not walking in the Spirit or fully prepared to serve and give out of love. Self-control, he says, includes the use of our time, our bodies, our minds, our emotions, and our spirits. It affects every aspect of our being. Keep listening. Becoming self-controlled under the lordship of Christ and the leadership of the Spirit is an ongoing process. And I agree with everything that he said there, because the fruit of the Spirit is implanted in us at salvation. God puts that in there. It is the fruit of the Spirit in us. And yet we have the opportunity to hone it and enhance it and develop it as we go through our lives and the situations that come into life. So let me just start with a question this morning. What is it, what area in your life is it that you need to practice more self-control? You probably already know, all of us already know. Is it in your spiritual life maybe, in your Bible study, in prayer or witnessing. Maybe it's spiritually. Maybe for you, you would be honest and say, I really need some more self-control with my anger, with my temper. Maybe it's eating. Are you like the guy who went to the doctor and the doctor said, "Sir, I kind of hate to tell you this, but you're going to have to give up those intimate dinners for two unless you have someone else with you." Feel like that? That'll catch a few of you on the way home. Just hang on. It'll come in for a landing in a few minutes. Substances. Do you need more self-control in maybe with substances? What about this? What about your tongue? Do you say too much? Gossip, innuendo? What area of self-control do you need to work on? God's Word talks about self-control mostly in the context of our bodies. In fact, the Apostle Paul, who wrote the text that we're reading today under the inspiration of the Spirit of God, of course, it wasn't Paul's idea. God had him write this down for us. But Paul talked a lot about self-control in his writing in the New Testament. He talked about it in terms of an athlete in training. He said in 1 Corinthians 9:25, "Now everyone who competes exercises self-control in everything. However, they do it to receive a perishable crown, but we an imperishable one." In other words, we should be people of self-control because we're going to stand before God one day and be rewarded or lose rewards based on how we've lived our lives since we came to Christ. Now, I know that when Paul talks about athletes, and he talks here about, he said, everyone who competes exercises self-control in everything. You have to understand he wrote that in the first century, way before steroids or all the money athletes make today, that they seem to be able just to do anything. Wasn't it Tiger Woods who said that the reason he went out and did all those things that he did and literally wrecked his marriage was because he just had so much money, and he just felt so empowered nobody could keep him from doing what he wanted to do. What is that? It's a lack of self-control. Listen to what Paul said in 2 Timothy 2:5. "An athlete is not crowned unless he competes according to the rules." In other words, athletes are supposed to rein themselves into the boundaries of the rule book. And if you think that's not still important today, ask Barry Bonds or Roger Clemens, who still may face jail time for lying to Congress about steroids. Think about Olympians who get stripped of their medals after the events because they find out that they cheated in some way. No, an athlete's not crowned. Paul said you don't get the medal or the trophy unless you do it according to the rules. He talked about self-control in terms of athletes in training. He also talked about self-control in terms of ministry. In 1 Corinthians 9:27, he said, "But I discipline my body, and I keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified." Paul was so concerned that after he had shared God's Word with other people, then he would do something in his own life that would disqualify him in their eyes and maybe even in service to God. I've been watching this week. You probably have seen it on the news. There's a pastor, I think he's in Atlanta, Georgia, who has been accused this week of some pretty awful things sexually in his own life, in his ministry. In fact, I read, I think it was on Fox News' website this week, that today he's standing in front of his congregation, and like 25,000 he runs, and giving his answers to those allegations. I don't know if he's guilty of those things or not, but if he is, I promise you it's because it was a lack of self-control in his life after he had preached to others. He wasn't practicing what he preached. So this subject is so woven throughout God's Word that I just have one shot at this with you this morning. And so I had to just pick a couple of areas in which God's Word deals with self-control very specifically, and to try to help us and give us something we can learn today. And it just so happens that these two areas, I think, are greatly needed in our culture. So this morning, let me talk to you about them. Two areas specifically that the Bible addresses the desperate need for self-control. Area number one is self-control sexually. Self-control sexually. Now, I could stand here this morning and literally bombard you for an hour probably with statistics about how sexually driven our society is. But unless you've been living in a cave, you already know the attitude of our society when it comes to sexuality. We live in a sexually driven society. In the evenings that we happen to all be home at our house and sit down and watch TV shows as a family, it is not unusual. It happened just last night. We were watching some things, and it's not uncommon that sometime you just have to turn that channel because what's coming over that television channel is just not appropriate. And I'm just talking about the commercials. Not even talking about the programs. It's just crazy. And we're just bombarded and inundated with that in our music, in our TV shows and commercials and magazines and soap operas and all those kinds of things are regularly